name is Collier. I'm from South Africa, and I'm a data scientist with Toptel. If you're not aware of Toptel, then they are a global network that represents the top 3% of freelance talent. And today I'm going to be talking about Recently, which is a little side project that I've been working on for about the last 9 months. When I say that it's a little project, to be honest, I would say that it's consumed the vast majority of my free time in those 9 months. But before I start telling you about Recently, I have a short preamble, and that preamble starts with a confession. But wait, there's more. So I'm sorry. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, I'm sure it's going to be really old hat for you, but for me, it's all been very bright and shiny and new. So I hope that you're going to cut me just a little bit of slack. So I've told you what I'm not. Let me tell you what I am. I used to be just a regular scientist before I became a data scientist, and now in my current role, I find it a little bit frustrating because a lot of what I do seems to lack real scientific rigor. So when I'm looking for a side project, generally it's something that's going to allow me to scratch that particular itch, play being a real scientist again. And that's what I've managed to achieve with Recently. But for this afternoon, more important than being a frustrated scientist, I'm a runner. Maybe I flatter myself a little bit by calling myself a runner, because I'm not a runner in the same sense that Usain Bolt or Paul Radcliffe are runners. To be honest, I'm probably more of a trotter or a jogger. But anyway, I get up early in the morning and I run around the neighborhood, and I do that on a fairly regular basis. And living in South Africa is actually pretty ideal if you're a runner. Now, I have absolutely no facts to back this up, but I'm fairly confident when I state that South Africa is the very epicenter of running on Earth. And the reason I can say that is we have literally thousands of running clubs and many, many events. This weekend in South Africa, there are no fewer than 15 events taking place at various locations around the country. So let's take a moment to consider what makes a runner happy. Well, new shoes and new kit, and this especially applies to the lady runners for some particular reason. The guys are more interested in new gadgets, that new GPS watch or the fancy new running iPod. We're quite in favor of good weather as well. There's nothing better than getting up on a crisp autumn morning and going out for a delightful run, especially in the countryside. But having said that, good weather is not an essential. God knows that I have run in some of the shittiest weather imaginable. What really, really helps when you're running in shitty weather is to have a bunch of other happy runners along with you. Finally, runners like to have new and exciting races, and they like to see their results from those races. But runners have a problem. Now this, I think, is kind of stating the obvious. We have black toenails, we have calluses, we have this obsessive compulsion to wash our hands because we don't want to get sick because that'll stop us from running. But beyond those things, we also have another problem, and this applies to the vast majority of people who've been running for more than a couple of years, and that is a record-keeping problem. If you look around the house of the average runner, what you'll find in one of their rooms will be a notebook, a deeply dog-eared notebook, in which they have scrupulously noted every run that they have taken for the last N years, in great detail. Times, distances, how they felt on the day, what they ate before the run, all that kind of information. Now the problem with this is a logbook like that is a lot of work to maintain. So enter something like Strava. Strava will grab the data directly from your GPS watch and record all the details for every run you take. The time, the distance, the actual details of exactly where you're at. It's fantastic. It takes all of that grunt work away from you. However, I have one major problem with Strava and the like, and that is that it doesn't differentiate between a training run and a race. Now, if you're a runner, you'll realize that these are two totally different beasts. The training run can be done at a fairly low pace, and it's just about conditioning your body. The race, however, is balls to the wall. You're going to try and do as well as you possibly can, because your mates are going to be comparing themselves to you. Strava doesn't see them as two different things. And this then brings me to the very core of the problem. If you're interested in race results, then they are distributed across the entire internet. So for South African race results alone, there are 7 different sites that you need to visit to get a complete picture of yourself as a racer. So here's a wild idea. What if we could grab all of those data and aggregate them in just one place? So you could visit that site and see a complete picture of your history as a runner. And you could then compare that to your friends and indeed your enemies. And from the selfish perspective of a scientist, this would present a treasure trove of data, because you would be able to use it to characterize that curious beast that is the long-distance runner, and you'd be able to look at them as a great big sweaty toy. And this was the motivation behind Recently, to have all of your race results in one place. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm neither a developer nor a web developer, so putting together Recently was quite an adventure. And along the way, I took a variety of notes, and this is part of what I'm going to share with you this afternoon. So, note number 1, you need to have the right tools. Now, as a data scientist, I historically spent, I would say, between 90 and 95% of my time working with just one tool, and that tool is called R. Now, if you're not a data scientist, it's very likely that you don't even know that R exists. What you do probably know is the same, that if all you have is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. And this is the way that I felt about R. I knew that I could achieve most of what I set out to do with Recently with R alone. I could use it to scrape the data, I could pre-process the data, I could interact with the database, I could produce visualizations, and I could do the analytics. But what I could not do very well with R was produce an actual website. So, with regret, I had to acknowledge that perhaps R was not the right tool for the job. I was not entirely sure that I was ever going to say that, but I did. So I started pushing around other tools, and of course, there is a plethora of other options for building websites, but the set of tools that I settled on was Django for the website, MySQL for the backend, and D3 for visualizations. Now, you've heard about D3 this morning already. You're going to be seeing a bit more about it later on. Now, this links to a rather interesting story, and that is about the same time that I was starting working on Recently, I was doing some consulting work for a bank in Johannesburg. It was a 2-day gig, and during the course of the first day, I had been working exclusively in R, and I'd managed to achieve almost everything that the client required of me. But towards the end of the day, I realized that there was one aspect of the project that I was not going to be able to accomplish in R. So that evening, I scuttled back to my hotel room and started madly researching alternative options. And one of the options I encountered was Django, and it sounded like it ticked all of the boxes for what I was setting out to achieve. So that evening, thanks to the bounty of YouTube, I took myself from knowing absolutely nothing about Django to being, I would say, a relatively competent Django developer in a matter of, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 hours. So that by 8 o'clock the next morning, I had a working prototype that I could present to the client. Now, I'm not telling you this to impress upon you my talent as a developer, because we've already established that that is non-existent. But what I am trying to tell you is that Django is extremely powerful in the sense that you can go from 0 to competent in a very short period of time and actually start producing useful things. So, note number 2. If you're aiming to produce a site like Recently, then you need to have a source of data. And I knew where I was going to get the data from, but I needed to have a systematic way of doing that. And what I was planning on doing was employing web scraping. Now, if you're not familiar with this idea, it's basically that you build an automated tool to visit a bunch of websites or a single website and download the contents. Now, To illustrate the idea, supposing, for example, we wanted to get the temperature in Sophia from the Weather Underground website. So the one approach to this would be that we visit the site and we find the temperature, 10 degrees. Great, we scribble that down. But what happens if we wanted to do this on a regular, say, 1 hour basis? It becomes a little bit onerous having to keep going back to the site every hour, right? So ideally we'd like to automate this task. And R, as it happens, is ideally suited to this particular task. There are actually two ways to go about this, at least two ways in R, and I'm going to tell you about both of them. The first of them is using a package called RBest. Now, this is written by Abby Wickham, and it forms part of tidyverse, which means it makes liberal use of the pipe operator. Now, if you've worked in a Unix environment, then you know how piping works. Basically, the idea is it takes the output from one function and pipes it in as the input to the following function. So I'm just going to run you through the idea of how we would go about scraping the Weather Underground site. So it's just a series of 3 commands. The first one is read HTML, and it just basically goes to the website and grabs the content of that page. It takes the result of the operation and pipes it using the pipe operator into the HTML node function. HTML node isolates the element on the page that we're interested in, and it does that using a CSS locator. And the result of that operation is then piped into HTML text, which just extracts the textual content of that node, 10, precisely the result that we're looking for. The joy of the pipe in this scenario is it allows us to avoid having a whole bunch of temporary variables, which to me is very, very cool. So this is a simple example. Let's look at something that's a little bit more pertinent to racing. So these are the race results for the Stella Royal 25-kilometer race, which happened in Durban last month. And this is particularly nice for the purposes of web scraping for 2 reasons. One is that the URL has a unique identifier for this particular race. So the Stella Royal is race 447, and that allows us to address it directly. And secondly, the data is presented in one enormous table, which makes the parsing particularly easy. So using RBest to scrape the site is very transparent. We start off by using read HTML, which gets the HTML content on the page, pipes it into HTML nodes, which picks out all the tabular elements in the page. Now, this website is a little bit old school. The web designer had actually used tables for layout, and this meant that the table that we're looking for, the data table, was not actually the only table on the page. So we had to use an indexing operator to pick out the actual table that we're interested in. The result is then piped into HTML table, and what that does is it passes the table element and converts it into an internal data structure within R, known as a data frame, and this is analogous to basically a table in a database. Then we select a couple of particular columns and look at the first 4 rows, and this is what the results look like, precisely the data that we've extracted from that web page. So this was a very easy example, but the nice thing about this is we can take this chunk of code and address it to every single race that's hosted by event timing and extract the corresponding information. Let's look at a page that's maybe a little bit more challenging. So this is from a site called Championship, the biggest site for race results in South Africa. And what you can see is, for a start, that the URL does not contain any identifiers for this race. And what that means is that you need to actually go to the home page for Championship and navigate your way to the page with the result that you're looking for. Furthermore, there are actually multiple distances for this particular race, and the individual distances are selected via a form on the top of the page. And the third aspect that makes this quite challenging is the fact that the data are paginated. So we see that there are only 25 results per page. So scraping this entire race results, you would need to go and scrape a bunch of 25 record chunks and then concatenate them all together after the fact. So this is actually quite an ambitious project. I don't plan to show you the code for this, but I can give you a flavor of how you go about doing this. And the tool, the package that you'd use is R Selenium, which is an R package which wraps the Selenium set of tools for browser automation. Now, if you haven't encountered Selenium, this is definitely something we should take a look at. It's a way of driving a browser programmatically, and it's spectacularly handy, especially for testing purposes. Now, to give you an idea of how this all works, what I'm going to do is use R Selenium to drive a browser to execute a query on Google. So this is how it would work. We load up the Selenium library, we start the server. So the Selenium server is actually a JavaScript object that we kick off and run in the background. We then instantiate a browser which opens up as a separate window on your desktop, and we navigate to Google. So you can watch that browser almost by magic navigating across to Google. We then want to enter our search term. Now the way we do this, we first have to isolate the search box on that page, and again we do that using a CSS selector, and then we use the send keys to element method to actually enter in the search term. If we're doing this by hand, the next step would be to click the search button. If we're doing it programmatically, then we need to identify the search button, again using a CSS locator, and then we use the click element method to actually programmatically click that button. And the browser will then move across to the Google search results. Basically, everything that you can do by hand in a browser is mirrored in Selenium. So for example, the back and forward buttons that you have on your browser window are mirrored by the go back and go forward methods. It's extremely powerful. This is just a short personal plug. We're putting together a couple of courses on web scraping in R and Python, and if you're interested in either of those, please come chat to me afterwards. So, once you've scraped data from all of these different websites, you now need to get it into the system. And this is what the complete data pipeline for RaceMD looks like. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. The interim steps, although completely essential to ensuring that the data in RaceMD are good, they are frightfully boring. And I'm not going to subject you to them this afternoon, so I'm going to skip straight through to the final stage, and that is the database. This is what the entity relationship diagram looks like for RaceMD. Don't try and memorize all of that. The majority of these tables are actually utilities that are used for the ETL and data validation process. We're going to focus on the 5 core tables, of which the license table is actually the most important. And the reason for this is that every year, Athletics South Africa associates with every registered runner a license. And that has a unique license number. And that basically gives you a one-to-one mapping between a runner and the club that he belongs to. And this is going to become essential when we start passing the race results, because it will allow you to allocate a result to a particular runner. But there's a problem, and that is the data that we've scraped is dirty. Now, anyone who's worked with data in the real world will know this. Data are dirty. I would go so far to say that racing data are probably amongst the dirtiest data you are ever likely to encounter. These data are filthy. Now, why is this? Well, there is one particular reason for that, and that is that these data are recorded by the runners themselves under non-ideal conditions. Generally, very early in the morning, in the dark, and with a shared pen. It's not ideal. And add to that the fact that runners are slack. Well, to be a little bit more charitable, let's just say that they lack attention to detail. And this is what I mean. Because of this, we encounter 3 major data challenges. And the first scenario that I'm going to tell you about is what I call the many athletes, one name scenario. So picture this. You are hosting a race with a few thousand athletes taking part, and there are 2 people called John Smith. Now, how do you differentiate between those 2 John Smiths? It's a very real problem. It's worse than that. In South Africa, all of these names, which you might seem quite exotic, are actually quite common. So, for example, in my data, I have 5 Philani Sondis and 7 Krishnadus. This presents an issue that every time multiple instances of these runners occur in my race results, I have to somehow figure out which Krishnadu it's referring to. Fortunately, there's a way around doing this. So, for example, 2 Beckham Tendus, I can tell them apart by virtue of the fact that they have different licenses, and those licenses map to different clubs. So, for example, this Becky is a member of Nedbank, and this Becky is a member of Imminent Beach Striders. So this is great. Ambiguity resolved. Let's look at data challenge number 2. This is kind of the conjugate. Here we have one athlete, many names. How does this happen? Well, there are a variety of roots to this problem. One of them is simple inconsistency. So, for example, either the inclusion or exclusion of a middle initial. Here you can see that, for example, here, Mbuso. He appears 4 times in my data in various different guises. Sometimes he's a Mbuso A, other times he's a Mbuso Albert, and other times his middle initial is left out altogether. But they all refer to the same person, right? Then you have the people who use their first names kind of interchangeably. So we have Daydreamer Stabisu, who is also known as Stabisu Daydreamer. You see, we just swap those names around, it's all good. Some runners like to use short names. So for example, we have Michael Brown, also known as Mike Brown, and a lady who might be his wife, although I have no idea, Catherine Brown, who's also known as Cathy Brown, I think. Even more worrying are runners that use nicknames. I would like to know that Craig Maguire is also known as Moggy Maguire, and that Bill Smith is also Barnacle Bill Freeman Smith. So to the friends of these runners, I'm sure that these names are very amusing, but to me they're a colossal pain in the ass, and I am not amused. So, again, looking at Henry Clark, who's also known as Nobby Clark, we can tell that this is the same person because both of them run for Forest Hills and both of them have the same license number, 7172. Ambiguity resolved. Of course, both of the first data challenges are only fixable if our club data is reliable. And this is not necessarily always the case, because there are a variety of variations in the ways that runners will write down their club names. Let's take a look at an example. The Oasis Crescent Athletic Club appears in my data in a variety of different forms. So somehow I have to figure out that all of these are referring to the same club. There are 2 approaches that lead to doing this. One of them is the big hammer approach, right? Using regular expressions. I've built a separate table in my database in which I have constructed a whole series of regular expressions that allows me to map between the various permutations of these club names and the single club object. And then the smaller hammer, which is based on fuzzy matching, and this allows me to differentiate between small spelling mistakes and translation of individual letters and names. Between the 2 of these, most of the ambiguities related to club names can be resolved. Observation number 4. You need to have an API. I'll be honest, I've worked very hard to accumulate and clean all this data, and it was never my intention to just really share it with everyone via an API. However, I discovered that it was unavoidable. If I wanted to use D3 for my visualizations, then I was going to have an API. And the reason for this is that although I'm perfectly comfortable with using the built-in methods within Django to produce a query set, populate a template, and then render a page, that methodology is not going to work with Django. I need an alternative way to deliver the data to, with D3. I need an alternative way to deliver the data to D3. So I took a very naive approach initially and basically just built a normal view within Django which produces a query set, and that query set I then just translated into a JSON request and sent back to the client. And that was perfectly satisfactory. It produced a nice big JSON log, which I could then ship off to T3 and produce visualizations. It worked immaculately. It wasn't a very pretty solution, but it was effective. And then I discovered that I was reinventing the wheel, because there is an entire framework within Django, the REST framework, which I was completely oblivious of. So once I found out about it, it made my life so much easier. And in addition, I got some bells and whistles on top. For example, it produces this web browsable API interface, which is fantastic for me as a developer, but also means that if at some stage another developer decides to come along and use my API, it's very easy for them to figure out how it all works, because they can just browse this interface. So I built an API, and that allowed me to start generating visualizations. And the site currently has 3 different types of visualizations. I'm going to show you 2 now, and save another one for the end. So the first of these is a bubble map, and I hope you can see this, it's a little bit faint, but basically the bubble map has around 45,000 bubbles. Each bubble represents 1 athlete. The radius of the bubble is proportional to the total distance raced by that particular athlete, and the color reflects the gender. So there are a whole bunch of pink and blue bubbles, and it's nice and reactive in the sense that you can drag your mouse across it, and when your mouse hovers over a particular bubble, you get a little pop-up that tells you who that athlete is and some of their vital statistics. That's pretty neat. Then, something that's a lot simpler at least, but I think very, very useful, and I'm completely amazed that this hasn't been implemented on other racing sites. It's a simple histogram. So this shows you what the distribution of times is within a particular race. As an individual runner, this is really handy because you can take your time, so say 3 hours 40, and see where that falls relative to the rest of the field. But you can also make some general observations about runners. So for example, we can see here that there are these 2 big spikes in the distribution. Those are the runners that are running really hard to come in under 4 or 5 hours. Those are kind of the benchmark times for a marathon, right? If you don't have a histogram, you just don't see that in the data. Okay, my final observation. Data tables is amazing. Data tables is amazing. The reason I say that is that it allows you, it's a jQuery plugin, and if you're not using it to render your tables, you totally should be. It allows you to take a plain vanilla table and turn it into, well, what I consider to be a reactive work of art. It's very, very simple. There's a bunch of CSS and JavaScript boilerplate code which you just need to insert without too much thought. Then you need to link the plugin up to your particular table. You do that again using an HTML identifier. And then you need to actually take your markup code for that table, associate a couple of different classes, and ensure that that table has a T-head section. And you're done. And you get a table that comes with a bunch of extra things for free. So, for starters, you have automatic pagination. You have an enormous table that's really, really handy to break it down into small segments so that the user can just page through them. This comes for free, and you can choose exactly how many records you want to have per page. You have searching in your table for free. You can also easily order by any one of the columns in the table. And probably the most important part for me was that it's automatically reactive, and that is that it goes very nicely from a wide format screen to a much smaller device. So this is what the table looks like on my laptop. This is what it looks like on my phone, and what you can see is that some of the non-essential columns have disappeared, and they've been replaced by a nice little drop-down button. If you're interested in a particular runner, you just press the drop-down. It's great. Okay, so that's all that I have to tell you about racing. But I haven't told you how this enabled me to scratch my scientific itch. So I've tried to answer a number of questions using the data from Racing, and I'm going to tell you about just 2 of those. So the first of these is an objective comparison between 2 races that take place in my home province of KwaZulu-Natal. So this is the Hillcrest and Maritzburg Marathon. They both happen in the very sweaty month of February, when temperatures are in the upper 30s or lower 40s. The humidity is somewhere around 90%. It's a horrendous time to be racing. But they're extremely popular races. And the reason for that is that they're both qualifiers for the Comrades Marathon. If you don't know what the Comrades Marathon is, it is the most epic ultramarathon that takes place between Durban and Pietermaritzburg every year. Look it up. It's an institution. Anyway, before I actually started to make a scientific comparison between these races, I thought, well, it would be interesting to have some anecdotal evidence. What do people think about these races relative to each other? So I consulted some experts. The first of these is Yvette. Now, Yvette is a seasoned marathon and ultra-marathon runner. She's also an Iron Man or Iron Woman, I'm not sure. She also happens to be my training partner. So we know each other pretty well. So I didn't hesitate to ask her about her thoughts on these two races. And she was very clear about what she considered to be the easier race. In her mind, Maritzburg was definitely easier than Hillcrest. And that was for one sole reason. And that was that at Maritzburg, you had a nice undulating course, which was easier on the legs, whereas in Hillcrest, you had these long descents followed by equally long ascents, which are absolute hell on the legs. In addition to that, she also pointed out to me that she drank far too much beer following Hillcrest. I didn't really see this as a problem, but it's okay. Consulting two other experts, Ollie and Carl, they both concurred with the events. Maritzburg was the easier race. However, it's easy for even experts like those three to be fooled by their preconceived ideas and biases. So what I really preferred to do was have a look at the data. What did the data tell us about these two races relative to each other? So I started off working in R again by doing something very, very simple. I took all the results for the two races going back 9 years, put them into a single table, and I ordered them according to time. And then I looked at the first top 10 results. And this is what I found. 8 out of the top 10 results were at Maritzburg. So this is consistent with what I got from the experts. Maritzburg is an easier race. But there's a problem with an analysis like this, right? I'm only looking at the very top of the field, the elite runners. It doesn't tell you about the experience of either race from the perspective of the average Joe like myself, someone in the middle of the field, right? So it's a completely biased view. To get something that's a little bit more objective, we can look at the distribution of times within the race. Now this is a visualization generated in R, and it shows the distribution of times for Hillcrest in green in the background and Maritzburg in blue in the foreground, and it shows us something quite interesting. And that is that at Maritzburg, there are more runners with short times and also more runners with long times. In statistical terms, we'd say that this is a distribution with fatter tails. However, it's not very helpful in terms of making an objective comparison between the two races. What we really need is to have a couple of numbers which you can compare to each other. And the number that makes sense is to have some sort of an average or a mean. So we can easily create means for two races. In this case, what I've done is looked at the average times for Hillcrest and Maritzburg broken down by gender. And here we see something that's quite interesting. Men seem to do about the same. On average, about 251 minutes for the marathon. Women, on the other hand, seem to be 6 minutes faster at Hillcrest than at Maritzburg. Now that's a problem because Maritzburg is supposed to be the easier and faster race. Something's not quite right here. So let's try something different. We'll just execute a standard statistical test. So the t-test is one of the most fundamental tools in statistics. And what we're going to do is compare the average time between the two races. And we see that there is a statistically significant difference between those averages, but that the average time for Hillcrest is less than the average time for Maritzburg. What the hell? This is very frustrating, especially when you have an idea of what you want to see in your data and you just are not getting it, right? So, I had to dig a bit deeper, find out why. So I went back to do some more exploratory analysis, and this time, rather than looking at one enormous distribution across all 9 years, I broke it down into 9 individual years. And this was where I encountered my problem. In 2009 and 2010, Hillcrest imposed a 5-hour cutoff on their race. And that meant that for those 2 years, there were no times that were greater than 5 hours. So there was a bias in those years. I was no longer comparing apples with apples between those two races in those 2 years. There are a couple of approaches that I could have taken to dealing with this problem. One of them would have been to simply toss out the data for those 2 years. But you know, I've worked hard to get this data, so I'm kind of loath to just describe 20% of it. And then I thought about it for a little while. And I realized that, well, I've meticulously manicured this data. And as a result, I actually have multiple times for individual athletes. And that means that I can go ahead and make a plot like this, right? Every point in this plot represents a single athlete, giving their time at Hillcrest and their time at Maritzburg. The red line is a least squared linear fit all of those points, which means that basically it characterizes the average of the entire population. The dashed black curve is what you would get if on average people ran the same time for both races. And what we see here is the red curve lies beneath the black curve, which indicates that on average, if you handle the data correctly, which I am now, finally, people are running faster in Maritzburg than they are in Hillcrest. Success. You can actually dig right down to the details here using R and evaluate the actual parameters for that red line. And we see that the slope of the line is 0.98, and this means that on average, runners are 2% faster in Maritzburg. If we execute a paired t-test, we've talked about the t-test and the paired t-test. If you think about two scalpels, a blunt one and a sharp one, the paired t-test is the sharp scalpel, right? It's a much more exacting test of our data. And what the paired t-test tells us again is that there's a statistically significant difference between the two races, and that the difference on average is around 3.5 minutes. Now, that might not sound like a particularly large margin to you, but I can assure you that if you're spending hours slogging over the tar, the baking tar in KwaZulu-Natal, then every minute you can save on your time counts. The other thing that I took a look at was gender ratios. Now, in addition to South Africa being the epicenter of all things related to running, we also do some rather interesting real science related to running. And who here is familiar with the name Tim Noakes? Banting? Wow, okay. So Tim Noakes is in South Africa quite a famous scientist. I mean, he's a sports scientist, but he's come up with this low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is known as banting. Very, very popular in South Africa and very controversial. Anyway, about 10 years ago, he published this paper with some of his collaborators in which he speculated that for longer distance races, women are better than men. I know, wow. Unfortunately, the data that I have recently doesn't actually allow me to examine this question. And the reason for that is that the longest distance that I have is 68 kilometers. I need to go up to around 90 kilometers to see this effect. However, I can explore something that is kind of related, and that is the gender representation. But before I take a look at the South African data, let's look at what happens in America. Now, this is a plot of the number of people in America taking part in racing events. And we can see that from 1990 through to 2013, there's been a steady escalation in the number of runners taking part. But in addition to that, there's something very interesting taking place. If you go back to 1990, you can see that 75% of those runners are men. And sometime around 2010, the gender balance flips over. And in the present day, there are actually more women competing in races than there are men. Now, the situation in South Africa is similar, but not the same. We've seen that there are progressively more women taking part, but the sport is still dominated by men. Although this is only part of the picture. If we look at individual races that have multiple distances, then we see something very interesting. So this is the third visualization that I referred to earlier, and it's kind of like a pie chart, and it gives you the relative representation of males and females. So the Stair Rail race has both 25-kilometer and 10-kilometer event. And what we see is that for the 25-kilometer event, mostly men in the blue. But the 10K event, mostly women. Let's have a look at another race. The Maritzburg Marathon. 42-kilometer event, around 75% men. 10-kilometer event, somewhere between 60 and 70% women. I'm starting to see a pattern here, right? Let's look at one more race. The Allegheny Water Marathon. Here we have almost 80% men taking part in the marathon itself, and somewhere just short of 75% women in the shorter race. Have you heard the saying, one swallow doesn't make a summer? It means it's kind of dangerous to generalize from just a few examples, right? So I'd be very hesitant to go from these 3 isolated examples and make a broad sweeping statement. However, I have lots of other data, which means that I can produce a plot like this. What we have on the y-axis is a gender ratio. So the number of women taking part divided through by the number of men. And on the x-axis, distances ranging from 10 kilometers all the way through to 42 kilometers. And what we see is that shorter races, 10, 15, and 16 kilometers, are generally dominated by women. They're between 50 and 100% more women taking part in the shorter races. But in the longer races, there are far fewer women relative to the number of men. So this presents a very interesting paradox. Notes suggests that women are better over longer distances. My data suggests that women prefer shorter distances. For the moment, I'm going to just put this down to another example of the enigmatic nature of women and leave it right there. So this seems like a good opportunity to wrap things up. So in conclusion, I have a site called Racing, which I like to think of as being like Google for race results. It is wildly popular. I have 17 Twitter followers. I've had a lot of fun building this. I have learned a ridiculous amount. It's caused me a lot of pain and frustration. But you know, all it took was one email to make all of that pain and frustration a distant memory. Tim loves my work, and now I'm inspired. So I will leave you with this thought. Just go out and build something. Build something that interests you. Build something that's going to make you happy. Don't worry about perceived lack of skills or tools, because you'll pick them up along the way. Thank you very much.